Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Will Overstreet. I am the VP of Strategic Partnerships as well for GRIDSMART Technologies and on the board of Cyber and Information Security Consortium. Tony?
And hi, I'm Tony Rucci. I'm the Director of Information Security and Threat Intelligence for Information International Associates here in East Tennessee. And I too sit on the board of the CISC here with Will.
So today, as we talked about, as the title maybe led you to believe or led you to think, we want to talk a little bit about cybersecurity and as it relates to GRIDSMART's customers and partners. With that, we're going to make this very conversational as we go through this. And we just, like Christy said, we'll take questions at the end. So just encourage anybody as they go along. If you think of something, please do ask, and we'll get to it at the end. But, you know, anytime we talk about cybersecurity, we always want to kind of have this first thing of kind of displaying, because a lot of times people don't care, or they have several reasons for saying why they wouldn't care. And so as a part of that, we wanted to go through just a few of them of reasons why you wouldn't care. One of the big reasons, as you see the picture to the left, is the big hack, is a lot of people have the perception that it's the future. This isn't a concern for today. It's, you know, in Hollywood has made it look great and all these wonderful things, but it's not really going to happen. The next one is we read a lot of stories in newspaper and the Wall Street Journal and everything, and they're always talking about, you know, Fortune 500 company hacks. They're not really talking about anything smaller than that. So a lot of people think, I'm not one of those people. I don't have a company or I don't have the value they do, so I'm not a target. Then from there, people hear the rumor, well, you can't be 100% protected, so why try? And so it's kind of the thing of, if you can't do it 100% and there's still a risk out there, people don't think it's worth starting. And then as we see our ostrich bury their head, we also have a lot of people that think it's someone else's problem. It's the IT department's problem. I don't need to be concerned with it because that's not my job. And finally, what you hear a lot of people is, even if they identify it being a problem, it's so monumental in their mind that they say, we don't know where to start, so why should we? So it kind of freezes them by the amount of work they think that has to be done. So hopefully we'll go through that and talk a lot more about that and give everybody some good information today.
And quite frankly, some of the companies that we deal with in initial engagement, they'll argue that, you know, it's just part of doing business these days. We see it everywhere. We recognize that being compromised is part of business. Think of any big company that you can think of out there. They've all had their growing pains, and it's difficult to argue with that. But what you really want to do is focus on how do you make yourself a harder target, so that when somebody is you know, cruising the networks, they see that you're a harder target than the next guy, and you want to force them to go down to the next guy.
So with that, we'll get started more. So let's give you a few reasons why you might care. So if you're like one of our distributors or any other business that's a small business, here are a couple reasons you might want to care. The average number of attacks mostly against small businesses, happens to be about 4,000 attacks per day from cyber hackers from all over the world. Most of those taking place in the US. Of that, in 2017, 28% of companies lost money due to an actual hack. And probably the scariest stat is that 60% of small businesses go out of business after being hacked. For instance, in Knoxville, there was a cabinet maker. Cabinet maker bought materials from China. One day they got an email that said, hey, update our banking account information for your next wire transfer. They did, thinking it was legitimate. Well, they sent out their next payment for their next supply run of materials, and all of a sudden the material company from China called them and said, we never got paid. It turned out somebody had acted like that company, given them bank account information, and all of a sudden they're down $1 million and don't have anything to show for it. So it can be devastating to companies that might not know it.
And then when you calculate the cost of recovery for a lot of these companies, mid to large size companies, I mean, those numbers, you know, roll upwards of $3 to $4 million on average. And then for a small company to be able to provide any kind of run rate on the recovery, it just cripples them, as Will mentioned on there. You know, one of the things that I was doing, it's kind of ironic, is that this morning in working an active pen test. We're crawling some data and started seeing some live dumps going on this morning in some of the resources that we crawl in the darknet, as well as in the paste bin above surface as well. And so, you see that it's constantly information is being dumped there every day. And so we're seeing a lot of common companies that you're very familiar with and ones that you've seen compromised, several times over the last couple of years being dumped again today. And you'll see some public release, I'm sure, in short order.
Now, if you're GRIDSMART customers, such as the customers we sell to, traffic departments, cities, those kinds of groups, there are a couple other reasons you might want to care. You hear a lot of talks of traffic's wouldn't be really that big of a target, or you hear that a lot, but it's already happening, such as the San Francisco transit hack that happened this last year. You're seeing articles like this. It's scary easy to hack a traffic light anywhere on the web. And then, as people may not know, ISIS has already actually attempted their first autonomous vehicle. It just so happened that when they tried to attack a US base with it, their programming went so well, so it looked a little offset. So it was actually destroyed before it reached the US base and created what they said looked like about a mushroom-sized cloud when the bomb actually exploded. So today, there's already things going back. For instance, even on FEMA has a conversation on their website about how 2 traffic employees took over shut down a city's traffic department for 4 days, causing gridlock throughout the city. So these things are already happening. It's not a future tense of maybe this is going to happen or cities and traffic is not a target. It's already being targeted. And to even see this more so, what is actually happening, so the next slide, how do you do? This was, and this is not old, this is not anything new. Actually, the University of Michigan in 2014, a group of people from there actually went out and analyzed the security of traffic infrastructure. And here's what they found. They found that one of the big beliefs when you talk to guys in traffic is that it's impossible to make a light go all green. Can't do greens in all directions. Well, actually, they said, if we have physical access to that cabinet, as Tony can say, if you have physical access, you can make almost do anything. You can make it all directions go green. That's not an impossibility. It's a belief. They also found that most of the networks of these traffic networks and of what they were using were not encrypted, and they were very easy to hack remotely, not just having to have physical access. A lot of the things were using default passwords, and some of the traffic controllers had previously very old known exploits were still available and were not protected at that point in time. And Tony, I'll let you talk about how it hasn't really changed.
Well, I think my response to you, Will, was when we were having that discussion about you can't make them all green at the same time. My response was challenge accepted, which is a common response for us when people say you can't do something. But that's the same hacker mindset and mentality that a lot of the bad guys have out there as well. When you say you can't do something, or, as HBO said many, many years ago, our satellite is unhackable and it's got encryption and it's unbreakable. And 11 minutes later, it was floating off it's probably reaching Pluto right about now. But so those are things that you see commonplace. And so that doesn't distance the traffic networks and the controllers and those operating systems any different than a traditional network of today. We see a lot of the same findings and a lot of the same vulnerabilities on traditional networks today from vulnerabilities that have been out there for many, many years. Remediation has been posted out there in one of the remediation sites, and people just don't apply it. And so patching is extremely important.
And the real problem is even though there are ongoing attacks, the message is obviously not getting out there into the transportation market, because this roads and bridges in 2016, how vulnerable do you think departments of transportation are? Well, some people see it, they're very vulnerable to 26%, but you still have a whole 20% that doesn't think there's any problems, and the somewhat, well, probably not something that's a top priority for them to fix or worry about. And the next slide is even a little bit more distressing from that same one was, have you done enough? And as you'll see, only 10% think they've done enough. 90% really are in the no category because they have no idea whether Whether there has been done enough or not, it's just simply a question of, hope something doesn't happen, not are we actively trying to prevent something from happening. So that I'm going to take Tony over, talk a little bit about the education side, because we really do believe the key here is getting people out of the mentality of this is real, this is now, and getting to understand why that is important.
And when you look at the last bullet on there, the 70% who are not sure, so what are you doing to educate yourselves and your staff on being more sure and firm on whether you are at risk or not? Are you doing self-assessments? Are you doing some form of internal testing? Are you bringing trusted agencies or entities from outside your organization to come in and do some testing, either passive or active network assessments, or just pure education awareness and sending your people to the right schools that are able to maintain and upkeep your existing networks? And then where do you see yourself growing in the next 5 years, and start planning your training cycles around that to grow your network. Excuse me. So, the attackers for, this type of model are no different than what we see in traditional environments out there. And so you've got the full suite of everybody who is just the kind of the hacker hobbyist and the curious, the student, the child, the adult who acts like a child in a lot of cases, and they're just downloading and pointing, clicking, and hacking and laughing at the results, to anarchists who are becoming a lot more organized than they were probably 5 or 10 years ago, and they've got a lot of grief to kind of voice, and they see that there are some responses that they have an impact when they do voice their concerns publicly or privately to organizations, and they have direct impact. And then you start looking at the more organized underworld, who is extremely methodical. And when you start looking at a lot of the cyber criminals out there that are selling their wares and services in the dark net and the deep web, in those dark markets out there, they're extremely entrepreneur-like. And so when you start thinking about somebody who's starting a business, you want to start building trust and reputation, they do the exact same thing in some of those dark markets. And it's really interesting to learn that a lot of them have something similar to Yelp out there, where their companies and their organizations and their services, no matter how nefarious they are being rated by their customers and clients, or people who pay them once they've been hijacked and hit with ransomware. And then you take it all the way up to nation state sponsored threats, and you can't watch the news now without seeing some form of concern about being compromised by a nation state.
And then the biggest one of that, the insider.
Yeah, and so that all rolls back around to what I'm extremely passionate about is the insider threat. As a career counterintelligence guy, I focus on the insider threat, whether it's the malicious insider or the unintentional insider, because there's not necessarily a lot of group policy that drives people's activities on a network or infrastructure. And then you start thinking about, well, it really boils down to the human nature of management, of taking care of people. And in the counterintelligence world, we have a saying: if you take care of people, they'll take care of you. If you don't take care of people, they'll take care of you. So when you think about that and let that digest for a moment, it really boils back down to, there's a whole cradle to grave process when you bring somebody on board, or you bring somebody into your organization as a partner in that type of arrangement, orienting them, making sure everybody understands what the rules of the road are, but making sure you're maintaining those relationships in a positive manner. And then when you find that those partnerships and those relationships are dissolving, then you part ways, and you do that sooner rather than later, before it turns, critical. They reach critical mass, and then somebody ends up compromising your data. Because I can't count how many surveys I've seen in the years where, when employees were interviewed, if you were let go today, would you take company IP with you to help better your next job? And more than 90% of the people said, absolutely. I'm looking out for me. And so people, no matter how loyal they are, they're looking out for number one.
And the San Francisco hack with the subway system there was actually a former employee that they did not cut off access to 10 days after they had let him go. And he was the one that actually put the ransomware back onto their site. So it's definitely critical from, as Tony says, cradle to grave of how you onboard people to what do you need to lock them out of if it goes south, and how to protect yourself, because most of the issues come from an individual employee inside, from, as Tony said, from either making a mistake or they actually have bad intentions and are trying to do something on purpose, willfully.
Yeah, and we elaborated a little bit, oh, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. I was looking at the next slide on there. Yeah, so you really start thinking about, what happens to your data and how is it compromised, and, what are the end goals? Are they looking to compromise your data to be able to hold you ransom for that? That's the more common discussion that most folks have nowadays, is that I'm fearful of being hit with ransomware. And I'll tell you, from a guy who engages companies every day on incident response and being proactive but also reactive with companies, I don't care how good you are and how good your network is and how good your people are. At some point, that human in the loop, as we talked about, the unintentional insider, somebody's going to click on something, or somebody's going to send something to your organization that opens up and it creates a third order effect where your network is compromised, or one of your business partners are compromised and you're impacted through secondary means with ransomware. It's not always about holding your data hostage, but it's about, what do they really intend to do with that data? Or do they just intend to put you out of business because they're a competitor and they've contracted somebody off the dark net to make you look bad at a critical time, knowing that this was a big public event for you and you're a marketing firm and you failed miserably because you weren't able to access or accomplish your critical goal. And then, of course, denials of services, doesn't matter how secure your network is, they can hit you at your endpoint and at your perimeter, and they can stop you from communicating in your primary and secondary means, which a lot of organizations don't even consider having secondary or failover communications platforms unless they're in the big forums. It's something that has a real-time effect on a lot of them, and a lot of those services are acquired through some of the dark markets that are out there, whether they're buying or selling goods or services, and that's where a lot of this originates. And we're coming back full circle to how would something like this, and what would be the means to compromise something in a city infrastructure or into the traffic control systems. Those services may be purchased and take the pictures of the guns off of the ads there and put pictures of hackers in hoodies, because we all know that hackers are wearing hoodies and ski masks. That's how they operate, right? But they do sell their services out there, and for a variety of means. And somebody specializes on a specific type of system, or I'm a Cisco hacker, or I'm a I focus on airline industry, or whatever that might be. And so it's very methodical, very organized, but it's a marketplace out there. And it just takes one. We always say in the defense world, you have to be an A student if you work in computer network defense. The defenders have to be right all the time. But if you're a hacker, if you're on the offensive, you just have to be right once. You can be a D student and be a pretty decent hacker in a lot of cases, because once you get in, you're able to pivot and elevate privileges and find the right machine or provide that access. And if you can keep persistent access, it's game over for a lot of organizations. Or if you're able to get specific information. But a lot of times you don't even have to necessarily, penetrate the network itself. It's so easy that people are registering to all these personal accounts and Dropbox and LinkedIn and Spotify, you name the personal service, that they're using their corporate email accounts to log into and sign up for these services. And, you know, a lot of industries, surveys have been able to pick out that about 79% of the time, they're using the same passwords as they're using at work. So when we see these passwords dumps that are out there, and a lot of them come out in clear text, you can easily just reverse it and go right back to the parent domain and log in with that user's account. And if that user happens to be someone with elevated privileges, such as C-suiter or an administrative assistant for somebody who's senior in the organization, or heaven forbid, an administrator, then it's game over for that organization, because now you just open up the keys, the kingdom with the keys, you know. But that's something that's commonplace, and we see that all the time.
I think I want to add one thing, Tony, because
Sure.
Tony does a lot of work with the state of Nevada, the insurance for the different cities. Have him come out there and do a bunch of work with the different cities. And I know the small gap, something you know seen out there is people think they have a secure network, but they forget about the one switch or whatever else is out there in the world that somebody incorrectly set up.
Yeah, it's the low-hanging fruit, as we call it. I mean, I can't recall the last time we've done an assessment, whether it was a passive assessment or an active pen test, where you know, we didn't find printers or servers or switches that were deployed without default credentials out there. And we see that all the time. We have a saying in our world where your printer becomes my access point, because you've got Wi-Fi enabled, and, you know, admin or root, whatever that device is deployed with those default out-of-the-box credentials. So you spend a lot of time spinning that device up or that appliance. You put that server into production environment finally, but you left those default credentials on. As soon as I start scanning your network and I see that device on there, that's one of the first tries at trying to get into it. I'm going to hit that and get in. You know, every time I'll find one device at least on your network, and that's what Will's alluding to.
And so, I mean, just think about how easy it is. You know, yesterday or the day before, our old company got an email that said, Microsoft subscription, hey, you need to renew. You know, something's wrong with it. Click on this, fix it now. Well, if you click on that, you're all of a sudden going to let someone in the door to your service. I mean, these happen every day. I don't know, what was the number, Tony?
And that's something that impacts all of us. If you have an Office 365 account out there, all of our organizations who are using that, or your partners, are susceptible to this. And I think 328 million emails were traversed with this phishing attempt.
Yeah. So talking about why for transportation and traffic industry is the threat growing. There are a number of different reasons, but as we'll see, that it all relates back to the great thing about it is that it's in the news, and hackers are like anybody else. They see what are the hot and up and coming markets, and they know about them just as well. And as this smart city pictures, you can see it's talking about how cities and everything's going to be connected and all these different forms of information. And so today is when they start looking at how to get into that and take advantage of that. So not only the smart city movement, but also with autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles, it's just becoming more and more an attractive target of, I can win, this is going to be a big hit for me. And as we'll see on the next slide, for traffic specifically, it has a number of reasons why traffic has more risk in some ways than even other city departments and organizations. And it's, you know, as we use more data to communicate between not only the different intersections, but as we use that data to communicate to the vehicles, well, there's an advantage. If I can deny that service and that causes problems or is worth somebody's money to get that turned back on, that's an advantage to me. Also, as Tony talked about, as more and more IoT devices get connected, that leaves holes for one small device that you added into something that was protected now is the doorway in. And actually, well, there's NT-CIP standards are great, and that's great to help everybody work together and build bigger and better things. It does have the disadvantage that somebody that wants to hack traffic equipment can all of a sudden go look up those standards and get a baseline for what I need to know to be able to do what I have to do. As we talked about connected vehicles, what can I do? Is there a way for me to get into one vehicle and then get past the other vehicles? If I can control a vehicle, what kind of schemes can I do to get people to pay me money? And then we see the movement of, for all those connected vehicles, more and more cabinets are getting connected to the city's network or getting connected to a network. And so from there, they start looking at it as, is the traffic cabinet a way not only into the traffic part of this, but then can I work my way back up into the city and get into tax records and driver's license and all those other things? And so it becomes attractive, excuse me. And, the thing that cities and transportation and traffic departments have to deal with is they have these remote places with traffic cabinets. And where there's a theory out there that I've heard a couple of times from people that nobody wants to expose themselves, or, they wouldn't go open a cabinet. I think I'll let Tony take about what he actually thinks about that, since he's done this.
Well, you kind of use the illustration of, emails much more susceptible to being hacked nowadays than traditional mail out your mailbox, because people have to expose themselves to come out there and steal your mail, even though the penalties are much heftier in a lot of cases if they do steal that mail. They have to expose themselves. Well, then the same argument stands with, nobody's going to go out to a major intersection or a busy intersection and expose themselves in that cabinet. But the reality is, if you put a hard hat and a bright colored vest on, you can drive your car up there and open that cabinet with a key that you purchased for $5 on the internet, and you can pretty much do what you want. Nobody's going to ask you any questions out there. Or if you're a little squirmish about that, then you can go find one that's out in a remote area and learn about that device without anybody approaching you, and then go back and hit your target later on, because there's a high probability that there's a lot of the same gear in that major intersection box as the cabinet that's out there on the outskirts of town too.
And I think also just the point that everybody forgets is that they don't have to expose themselves. All they have to do is find someone with legitimate access and figure out what does it take for them to do it for them. So how much money does it take for somebody else to plug in a USB drive that's already working on the cabinets? There's 10,000, 5,000, there's a number out there, and they're going to try to find those people so that they don't have to expose themselves. And then not only that, but several times there's ways, as our study previously mentioned, and what they did was how they could sit in their car near a cabinet and do several kind of different hacks and certain things. So there's ways that cabinet is vulnerable for all kinds of different ways. That doesn't have to be physical present, but it really, in general, it's not that big a risk to actually go out there and be able to attack that cabinet.
But that risk is even going to grow, Will, over time, because of those smart technologies that are going into it. They're putting a lot of embedded connectivity and services out there into those technologies that are hitting the streets faster than they really should, because they hadn't been, assessed.
Right. And so, if we really look back at that study again, this, as we said, in 2014, they were already talking not only about the ways they would, how to get in and do this, but they were already talking about what they would do in the event of attack and how they would, make money or do that, from denying service and realizing the congestion would cost the city X amount of money so they could ransom that, to, if they wanted to coordinate attacks, how to hack the different lights around a particular area to reduce emergency vehicles in and people being able to get out prior to an attack. I mean, you could think about it from a more sophisticated Las Vegas style attack. If that person had said, I'm going to do this, and here are the major throughways and intersections in and around that area, that would be the type of thing that is now a more growing concern that will be used in the future moving forward.
Well, just a little bit indirectly related, though, you mentioned the Las Vegas attacks. One of the things that we did was we culled a lot of the data that we had already collected, and had it available to us at the time. But as soon as the Las Vegas attacks were unfolding, we jumped out and crawled it real quick, and we identified the attacker as well as his girlfriend's email accounts and their passwords, and we found their passwords in clear text had been dumped. And so we passed that on to law enforcement. But, you know, it's, again, the utility of data, and it's all about data granting access.
So to kind of, you know, make this more concrete, what we always like to do is to imagine is to how do you get somebody to think, well, what's this mean to me? And if we really look at it, the clearest way to do this is just say, okay, if someone with low moral character had my username and password, what could they do? What systems do I access? What things can I do remotely? What can I do on my computer, my work, for the city or anything else? And what would that give them access to? What would that allow them to do? And from there, you know, you just think about, could they deny me service where I couldn't do anything again? So what information could they get to that would be of value? That's where you've got to put yourself is, would that be a big problem? Would that be a small problem? That's where you have to start thinking is, what could they do if they had this free reign to this? How big a problem is that? And that really brings us to our next question, which is, if they did have it, how much would that cost if they did the worst possible thing they could with it, if they caused the most damage? You know, you ask on the money part of this, and people always just think, well, I don't have credit cards, or I can't pay cash out of that or anything like that. But think of it from a city's terms. You know, how much would it cost if all the controllers were locked down and I had ransomware? You'd have to replace all those devices. You'd have the congestion for however long it took you to repair and retime those intersections. What would that cost the economy, to the different businesses as that occurred? And then from there, you have to think about, what would the negative PR do? What would it do to our reputation? Who would handle the phone calls from citizens complaining and talking people through this? The police time, if they're having to direct traffic at these intersections and lights, then there's other things that they can't be doing to help protect and serve the citizens, as well as emergency vehicles are not going to be able to get through. So you have to think of it not just, okay, they got into this and they were able to access this, but if they took control of that and locked someone out, what are the third order effects that continually branch off of that really calculate the total cost? Because as we've stated, hackers are becoming much more at being able to price, value-based pricing, not just looking at, okay, what are you willing to pay me, but what is this going to cost you in total terms to fix, to repair, and all this? That's the number I'm going to ask for, not just the straight up dollars, but the whole thing.
And those numbers are directly related to, what did you do in advance, you know, proactively to build a resilient backup and recovery strategy, and have you practiced it? Because when that day inevitably happens, are you able to recover? Because that is game over for them. If they've compromised you and you're able to recover quickly, you can have yourself back up and running, and it's almost transparent to a lot of your end users when you're successful in that sense.
Now, earlier we mentioned, and we just want to make a mention of this, is that, you know, as we said, hacking is easy. Well, you know, just to start this one off, I'll let Tony go on to the next slide, but stolen passwords account for 75% of all attacks, and 71 to 79% of people use the same passwords again and again. So we had a challenge. I gave Tony a challenge, and I'll let him talk about his tool and what they did here, but we gave him a 4-city challenge. We're not going to give the names of the cities, but we wanted to just go out there and do a little bit of research and see what we could do.
Unless you're the highest bidder, then I can be socially engineered to giving up the information. In all seriousness. And so, yeah, we went out to mid-size and a couple of large-size cities up in the West Coast, and then Northeast, East Coast, and then Southwest. And he said, hey, just go see what's out there and go crawl some of your resources. We maintain about 200 live resources in the dark net and the deep web, and some creepy places that we don't tell mom and dad that we go to all the time, where we find a lot of these things, and we maintain a lot of services out there, and it's very methodical. But So kind of, ask yourself, what do you think the numbers returned? And these are the city accounts that we found for each of those respective cities that had been dumped, and passwords had been dumped along with them. And in a significant number of those, we got clear text passwords, and then the majority of them, there were SHA-1 passwords. And when they're unsalted, it's actually pretty trivial to break that. So if we would have spent time on it, if this were a dedicated pen test, we would have spent time running that through our crackers, and we would have probably achieved a whole lot more on there. But I'm thinking that's not anything to scoff at anyway. That's enough to find probably a few game over accounts in there with somebody with some elevated privileges. And so now you have to ask yourself, if that's your city or if that's your responsibility and you're the IT manager for that specific organization, and that many accounts were compromised in your organization and somebody had privileges, what would that mean to you? And what would be the impact? So it's kind of rhetorical, but at the same time, it's not.
It's not good. I mean, that's why we think it's a concern, because obviously if it's that easy, that took, I don't know, what, couple hours max to find that. So, if Tony was a bad guy, it'd be problems right now of him being able to do what he could do to any one of those cities. We would have some serious issues.
And props to my guy, Alex, who runs Threat Intelligence. I mean, he's the one who's creeping around in those dirty spots.
and so we've taken up some time. We want to leave some time for questions, but we're going to hit this briefly. But where to start? As I said at the very beginning, that was a lot of people's issues of not knowing that. And so just quickly, Tony's going to hit, what is the cybersecurity, just to really think about. And then the good news is it doesn't have to start big. 20% of some basic things you can do make 80% of the difference. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about where us as GRIDSMART is going. So Tony, I'll let you get to that.
Yeah, so really what you think about is getting ahead of it and being proactive. I mentioned it earlier on, but being able to sit down and build an incident response plan and think about, sit in the room one day and just carve out a day where you sit around and think up bad scenarios. And usually you have to do it when everybody's mad, because you start thinking about all the bad stuff they would do to the network. But that's the same thing that happens, everywhere. So think about how you would build a resilient backup strategy and how you would recover. And then those are things that you have to put into place. And then you have to practice that because that's the thing that's extremely key. When you feel like you have a good recovery strategy, but you've never practiced it, when things go sideways, now you have to implement it. Now there's a lot of anxiety on your staff to actually execute. And so you want to have that confidence in your technology and your capabilities and your training to be able to run that full recovery deployment in your organization. It's not something that's taken lightly, but it saves you an extreme amount of money in the long run when you do that. And then building also in the capabilities to detect persistent activity in your organization or anomalous traffic inside your organization, whether it's your active insider or your unintentional insider. Maybe one of your employees travels a lot, or a lot of them do, and they're hitting these cafes all the time and the open Wi-Fi. And you pick the Starbucks, whatever it is, and then their machine's compromised. Now they bring it back to the enterprise, or they sync up in the network, and now your network is compromised as well. And so that's the unintentional insider. And so you need to be able to have some monitoring and some tools and capabilities there, so you can get some heads up on what is there, whether it's you're doing that internally or you do external third-party monitoring. You need to have some level of visibility in your network and change detection. And then being able to rise up and have the commitment and the buy-in and being able to execute that with the support from top down and bottom up. And everybody has to be on board to be able to execute and to be able to dedicate the funds, the resources, and the manpower to that.
And so, just a good place to start, just the easiest place is what's called a network assessment or a remote network assessment. It's just identifying where are you today. I mean, as Tony will say, the best place to start is just to say, are we at A, B, C, D, or F situation right now? Unless you've done a kind of the health check, you don't know what you need to do or not. And it's relatively inexpensive to do those things. And as Tony will tell you, that even his company has third-party other companies come in and do these things once a year, because outside set of eyes can get people out, looking at things they would have normally assumed. And so the easiest thing that anyone can do instead of worrying about, I need this and I need that, is just, where are you today? Because there's probably going to be very basic things, such as, like we saw with those cities, hey, employees, you can't use your city account for every other personal account that you do. We wouldn't have those usernames and passwords if that wasn't happening. So those are some basic things that can really improve one organization's security level over another. And so just talking about what we as a company at GRIDSMART are doing. So as VP of Strategic Partnerships, what I've started working on and building out is a network of trusted partners and service providers. And basically, with Tony, when I first met with Tony, his group, they knew security, but they didn't know traffic. And so we've been working together looking at traffic equipment, looking at it in the field, and really taking these partners through what are the problems, what are the difficulties that the traffic industry has that's so unique from anything else, and so that they understand that, because if something happens, they don't need to be being taught what's this piece of equipment or what's going on. They need to know that, because the reaction time is so important. And we also want to look at it as, how do we help protect this by focusing on it with our knowledge and with our partners' knowledge to be able to do this bigger and better than anyone else. So our goal is to put together a turnkey solution for our GRIDSMART customers that basically presents them with pre-qualified, trusted partners that already have that knowledge base of the traffic industry. And with our negotiations with them and of being able to do this, is to be able to bring those services and rates at a lower price point than they would normally be able to get just doing this on their own. So really, for our company, is we're about to launch this in the next month. We just, that's part of our business, is we see this as a need and an opportunity in this marketplace. And so the real goal of all of this is just, how do we help, it's securing the future of transportation. As much innovation is going on, there needs to be a match in that with what are we going to do to secure that. And that starts with what's out there today. And as a company, that real thinking has started making us, in everything that we do, start doing things differently, start thinking things differently. And that's why Tony and his group and another company right now are our partners that we work with, and work with our own stuff, and have started working with customers and other partners on.